Thank you, everybody. This is the session on land use, food prices, and security. I think you all are perfectly aware about the rules, but just to recall them. So all attendees except the person currently speaking must remain muted. Presentation is expected to take about 20 minutes, more or less. After the discussion, we have a period of about 10 minutes and where the question could be put also during the presentation on the chat. But since we have little people connected, I suggest that we also allow for direct voice questions. In this case, perhaps one possibility is that you use the 3 buttons down there to share raise your hands so that I can understand who has the right to do the question by voice. All right. So without further ado, we have 3 presentations, by the way. The first one is about Tobias Heyman. Title is Land for Fish, Does Plant-Based for the Demand of Aquaculture Production at Agricultural Markets. So yes, please go on, share your screen and start your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So so what I want to present to you today is our paper on the effects of aquaculture production on agricultural markets. We don't look at any land use effects from land conversion into ponds, so we just concentrate on the fodder demand. So as you can see here, fisheries is one of them, has a strong increase in production since the 1950s. And since the 1990s, the capture production is almost stagnating because most of the capture fish stocks are already at their maximum fishing levels. Some more and more are being overfished. And the increased demand for fish protein is met by aquaculture production. But while capture fish is stagnating, also fish meal production is stagnating, and fish meal use is becoming increasingly expensive. So the question emerged, what actually is feeding aquaculture fish? This brings us to the research question. So how large are the effects of aquaculture production on agricultural markets? Which regions are the ones which are most affected? And what happens if we want to rebuild sustainable wild fish stocks and achieve the SDG target 14.4? To analyze these questions, we use our DART biomodel. The DART biomodel has been initially constructed to analyze biofuel policies. And therefore, we have explicitly modeled the vegetable oil sector and in their co-production, also the vegetable meal sector. And this attribute allows us to derive a quite precise fodder composition for the aquaculture production. We use the GTAP9 database with the GTAP AEZ. We have 45 sectors in our model, mainly agricultural sectors and energy sectors, and we account for 21 regions. These are the additional fish sectors, which are now in biofish. So out of the original GTAP fish sector, we've split it one capture fish sector, which mainly fuels the fish meal sector, which is a linkage between capture fish and aquaculture fish. And then for the aquaculture sector, we derived, which required quite a lot of effort, the feed sector a feed composition from fish meal and plant-based fodder. And this feed composition is based on Paolo et al. From 2015. He derives fish-specific feed shares for 88% of the global commercial feed-fed aquaculture fish. And if we link this data, this fish-specific data, to the aquaculture production, the country-level aquaculture production data from FAO Fischstat, we account for about 80% of the fish, of the aquaculture fish out of the FAO data. And this then represents our feed composition. This is the production structure of our aquaculture fish sector. So on the right-hand side, it's as usual capital, labor, energy, and then we have intermediate inputs. But I think the most interesting thing is this fish feed composite, where on the one hand we have non-protein feed like wheat and maize, and on the other side we have protein feed. They are nested with a Leontief function, so you can't substitute protein feed by non-protein feed, but within the protein feed nest, we allow for substitution of 2. But of course, so we decided to go for an imperfect substitution. But in our sensibility analysis, we also look at different parameters here. We look at 4 different scenarios. So in the baseline, we take the FAO projection for capture fisheries and aquaculture production. And for fish meal production, we assume that the production remains constant until 2030. This is also what most of the scholars assume. Furthermore, in the next scenario, we look at the SDG 14, where we want to rebuild sustainable fish stocks by a reduction of capture fish of 5% per annum for 5 years, and then it remains constant until 2030. So this quantification is taken from the World Bank Sunken Billion reports and basically reflects the moderate path to achieve sustainable fish stocks. And here fish meal production is endogenous. In addition, we have 2 scenarios where we look at a double annual growth rate for aquaculture production. The reason is that the FAO projection, or in the FAO projection, the production for aquaculture is not limited by a lack of consumer demand, but rather by limiting factors in the production. For example, a lack of transport and storage infrastructure, but also regulational issues to get permissions to construct new sites for aquaculture production, and also disease outbreaks can play a role. However, these are technical and regulational issues that could be overcome. And in those 2 scenarios, we assume that we get back, or that we continue the growth rate of aquaculture production that we have at the beginning of the century, which is basically the double annual growth rate that the FAO assumes until 2030. And for one scenario, fish meal production is endogenous. And in the other scenario, we still assume that you can't just increase fish meal production because you are dependent on wild fish stocks. You are dependent on catching small pelagic fish, which get more and more scarce. So here we say that fish meal production also has to remain constant as in the baseline. Already in the baseline, we see that fish meal gets really expensive. So here the bars are showing the output for fish and fish fodder commodities, while the dashed lines show the price developments. And fish meal is very expensive, and followed by rapeseed meal, which is the most expensive oilseed meal. When we look at the quantities in the baseline, capture fish is more or less constant, as you see in the blue bars. And in the green bars, aquaculture fish expands in the baseline by about 3% per annum. Therefore, in the dark blue bars, we see a strong expansion in soybean meal production, which is also reflected in the low prices for soybean meal. This is our fish feed composition. So it's the same for all scenarios in 2018. And afterwards, we run the different scenario specification. So already in the baseline, because fish meal gets so expensive, the share of fish meal in the fish fodder composition is reduced to 17%, and it's mainly substituted by soybean meal. When we limit capture fisheries, fish meal gets even more scarce and more expensive, so the share drops to 13%. In the fast growth scenario, we have the same capture fish production as in the baseline, but now we have a double growth rate in aquaculture production, and therefore we consume more fish meal. So the share in the fodder composition is quite similar to the baseline, but in absolute terms, of course, it's more because we have now a higher aquaculture production. Therefore, when we limit the fish meal production in this scenario, so in absolute terms, it's the same as in the baseline, the share drops down to 13%, which is by coincidence quite close to the value of the SDG 14 scenario. And in nearly all scenarios, most of the substitution effect, or most of the most times the feed is substituted by soybean meal. And this is, of course, driven by developments in the global production and prices. So when we look at the oilseed crop sectors, so mainly rapeseed and soy, which are the most important vegetable fodder items for aquaculture fish, there we see that output strongly grows in the aquaculture expansion scenarios, stronger than in the SDG 14 scenario, and also the prices strongly increase. Moreover, we see some effects on the prices of other agricultural crops. So we see some spillover effects here, and also on the output. So when we produce more soy and more rapeseed, we produce less maize and other agricultural commodities. This is a very collective sector where we have all kinds of vegetable, fruits, and other crops. What's also interesting to see is that when we limit capture fish, we have a drop in production by 20%, which is passed through to a drop in fish meal production by 17%, and we see a huge price increase. And I think especially this number is important for regions where capture fish play a crucial role for the food basket. So when we want to go back to the sustainable fish stocks according to the World Bank scenario, we have a price increase of about 40%. And this is I think it's a huge step. And we also see an effect on the price of the fish meal. Another important point is that even when we expand aquaculture production, we see a positive price effect on capture fish. So capture fish gets more expensive because while on the one hand in the diet, capture fish is substituted by aquaculture fish, and so the price for capture fish should decrease. The demand for fish meal in both scenarios is stronger in compensating the price effect, so that in the end, the price for capture fish is increasing. So increasing aquaculture production in our model increases the pressure on capture fisheries. Another interesting result is that we see spillover effects, of course, on indoor livestock production. So when we produce less capture fish, we have an increase in indoor livestock production by 1.2%. And if we increase aquaculture production, we have a decrease in indoor livestock demand, which is mainly poultry and pig meat, which is a substitute for fish. As already mentioned, we have the strongest production expansion in absolute terms for soy. So we also see some land use effects in soy, especially in Brazil, in Paraguay, Argentina, and Chile, and the US. And in the US, it goes at the expense of wheat production and maize production. Rapeseed expansion plays a crucial role in China because here rapeseed is an important factor in the diet of aquaculture fish. And this, of course, has also implications on food and staple crop prices. So when we look at the SDG 14 scenario, where we limit the capture fish, especially in Brazil, in Latin America, but also in Canada and the US, so the regions where we have increased oilseed production, as fodder crop production, we see an increase in the staple crop prices, which are wheat, maize, and maize in these regions mainly, because we see some land use change. What's also popping out, of course, are these huge price increases for processed food and processed meat in Southern America and also in Africa. This is because here capture fish plays an important role in the processed food sector, and we have a strong substitution effect with processed meat. So when capture fish gets scarce and more expensive, also processed meat gets more expensive. So here the SDG 14 scenario has quite some negative impacts on the food price, so food prices rise. When we look at the scenario the most extreme scenario where we have a high aquaculture production and only limited availability for fish meal, we see the strongest increase for the staple crops, for wheat and maize, especially again in the areas which produce oilseeds, but now also in the major aquaculture producing regions in Asia. We see some increase in China, in Malaysia and Indonesia. Therefore, in India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and in the rest of Asia, which is Bangladesh, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, and so on, we see price decreases in the processed food sector and in the processed meat sector, because here the cheaper aquaculture fish from the production expansion leads to substitution effects. I want to highlight some regions for the welfare analysis. So only little countries actually gain from all scenarios, and these are mainly the countries that, like Canada, Brazil, but also US, produce the fodder for aquaculture fish, and they gain in each scenario. And also the EU gains, but they rather gains because they are here, they are net consumer of aquaculture, because they import a lot of aquaculture. Therefore, Paraguay, Argentina, and China, Chile, sorry. Here we see a decrease in aggregated income and an increase in the consumer price index in the SDG 14 scenario, because here the losses from reduced capture fisheries are stronger than the gains that this region has from increased fodder production to substitute the fish meal, which is the fish meal quantity that is reduced because we reduce the capture fish quantity. So here the shock from capture fishes plays a stronger role, but when we look at the aquaculture expansion scenarios, here the increase of fodder production leads to welfare gains. In Africa, we see smaller effects in those both scenarios, but therefore we see a strong effect in the consumer price index when we limit capture fisheries. In the aquaculture producing regions in Asia, we mainly see negative welfare effects. So of course here in the SDG 14 scenario, because the reduction in capture fisheries lead to negative welfare effects, and especially in the rest of Asia, we see a very strong price increase and a strong decrease in aggregated income. But also in the aquaculture expansion scenario, we see some negative welfare effects. This is because of the construction of the scenario. So as already mentioned before, we assume here that we overcome production constraints. So we overcome barriers for production. We don't have any efficiency gains or productivity gains. So we just produce more, and therefore we shift the supply curve while the demand curve stays constant. And therefore the drop in prices, so the reduction in aggregated income, is stronger than the drop in consumer prices. Therefore, the net welfare effects in the scenarios are negative. Also, what I want to mention, of course, for the SDG 14 scenario, when we rebuild sustainable fish stocks, we might have welfare gains which lie somewhere in the future and which we also don't account in a CGE model. Gains through ecosystem restoration, for example. So, so this might underestimate the real long-term effects. So to conclude, I think the results of this paper highlight the trade-offs between those three SDGs. So when we have a policy on SDG 14 to rebuild sustainable fish stocks, on the one hand, we have direct effects on food prices, on fish prices, for example, which affect SDG 2. But also we see some effects on life on land, or because we have a land use change. And this is passed through again to the via food prices and via staple crop prices to the SDG 2. On the other hand, if we increase aquaculture production to produce more protein feed, we also see feedback effects through fodder production on life on land. And again, also considering the fish meal production, we see some feedback effects on SDG 14. So there are trade-offs within the cycle of those three SDGs that need to be respected. Just to summarize, we see effects on aquacultural markets. For example, expanding aquaculture production has actually larger effects on agricultural markets than when we reduce fishing activities. Furthermore, the strongest effects are on soybean production, rapeseed production. Another important point is that expanding aquaculture leads to higher prices for capture fish in our model. So it doesn't relieve pressure on wild fish stocks. And we have mainly negative welfare effects for the aquaculture producing regions, so the fodder producing regions and the aquaculture consumers, net consumers, are gaining. What I didn't show in this slides now because of time constraints is that we did, of course, a sensitivity analysis. And yes, this elasticity parameter plays an important role for the fodder composition and also affects the prices of fish meal and oilseed meals. But when you look at the different scenario results and the changes between the scenarios, there is only a very low variation for other crops. So the spillover effects, the differences in spillover effects dependent on this elasticity parameter are not so big. Yeah, so thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Tobias. We already have 3 questions from the chat. Stating them in order. First question from Iman. Tobias, how do you consider change, if you do, change in diets? How does the share of fish products change in the consumer food mix?
So unfortunately, we can't look in the change in diet in terms of calorie changes or changes on protein feed. So for the private demand, we have a linear expenditure system included. So the changes are based on the price elasticities. But also for the trade and the food sector, so where we represent or where processed food is represented, but where also restaurants are represented, we assume an imperfect substitution for meat and fish in the intermediate nest. So it's also an elasticity of 2, which we select here, so that consumers there, or that we assume that consumers also in these sectors react on the prices.
Okay.
But,
okay. No, I think the point here is that in your model, consumption stay endogenous, and of course, since it is endogenous in the model, you cannot impose from the outset changes in diets in this configuration of the model. I think there is another question from Ron. What types of fish require fish meal as part of the feed mix?
Mainly finfish, for example, So there are some fish where, for example, salmon is one of the most prominent kind of fish that needed a lot of fish meal, but where also technological changes have led to a strong decrease in fish meal consumption. But there are also other like shrimp production, but also not all shrimp. So it's quite diverse. But the highest fish meal consumption, when we look at regions, are in Norway, of course, and also in Chile. So there where you have salmon production.
Great. Another question from the chat. Would you please talk about the dynamics of the model? How do you consider population change, income change? What are the time frame and time steps?
So the dynamics are basically, we take the population growth from the OECD. And we also look at we take the GDP from the OECD FAO Agricultural Outlook and also assume similar productivity gains in agricultural production. I think it's about 1.2% per annum. And these are the main dynamics that run our model.
Okay.
And,
but your model is still a comparative static one, isn't it?
No, it's a recursive dynamic.
Okay, sorry for that. Okay.
And we run it from 2011 until 2030. But between 2011 and 2018, all the scenarios are fixed, so they run the same. And this scenario specification just go into the model between 2018 and 2030.
All right. Are there other questions? You can also put a question directly by voice if you want. Matthias, you raised your hands. Please go on.
Thanks. I'm lazy typing, so I'll use it that way. Thanks, Tobias. Very interesting presentation. I do have a follow-up question to the question that Ron was posing. Well, there are fish that do eat other fish, and then there are fish that are herbivores, so they don't eat other fish. And would basically the model allow for some way of implicit or explicit substitution between those different aquaculture forms, either through, say, fish as a feed input becomes very expensive, so you basically substitute to more agricultural input? Or are there any forms where you basically say, well, maybe that becomes expensive or there's scarcity on fish meal, so basically agriculture itself changes the production towards other types of fish which don't need that input?
Mm-hmm. So the thing is that the dynamic or the demand of customers rather go to carnivorous fish, herbivorous fish, or even filter fish like carps play only a crucial role in China. And I also have there is a nice slide from the FAO that shows that the share of non-fat fish is rather decreasing. So the people go, unfortunately, to the fish that is consuming fish meal. But of course, you could implicitly assume that when we have a technological change in our model, so we substitute away from fish meal production, we don't know if it's because we improve the technology for one specific fish species, or the construction of the set of fish species change. So this is something we unfortunately cannot control. We just have one aquaculture sector, and we can control for specific species.
Thank you. There is another question, I think, from Ron. You raise your hands.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Tobias. That was an interesting presentation. This question for me is mostly technical. I think you're using the GTAP 9 database starting in 2011, and I'm using that also. You'll see later on in my presentation, but I haven't converted yet to 2014 or 2017. partly because it took a while for FAO to get their food balances updated beyond 2013, but they have done that now. The question for you is, how much work is it for you to update from a 2011 database in DART biofish to 2014 or the upcoming 2017 GTAP?
It took me about 2 years to do all the splittings that we need to do for DART biofish, because we really disaggregate the whole biofuel sector, which is kind of tedious. So we decided to skip the next GTAP version, because of course we would have some learning curve effects now, but yeah, it takes a lot of effort to do this. I think alone for splitting the fish sector, or to get the fish fodder shares correct, it needed like 25 splitting steps were shifted. And
thank you. I guess I'm not surprised. You know, I spend more time on data development than I do on the model itself. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, I think we can go to the second presentation. If you can stop sharing your screen, yep. Tobias. The second talk is by Alessandra Lanotte from GRC ISPRA, talking about economic impact of invasive alien species, linking ecosystem service accounts to general equilibrium models. Please, Alessandra.
Thank you. My name is, Alessandra Lanotte. I work at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in the Land Resource Unit. And specifically, I'm working in the team devoted to natural capital accounting. I myself, I'm an environmental economist, but in the team are working together with an ecological modeler, an hydrologist, a GIS analyst, a marine biologist. I mean, we are quite an heterogeneous team of people whose aim, whose objective is to try to kind of mainstream ecosystem into the economy. Traditionally, this is understood in most cases as putting an economic value to environmental goods and services. And actually, in a report that was published recently yesterday, it came out yesterday by Eurostat, we managed to assess and value 7 ecosystem services that within the European Union is providing a yearly flow of 171 billion euros. And we are also able to assess which are the ecosystem type that are mostly provide most of these services, and woodland and forest almost provide half of the total amount on these 7 ecosystem services, and which are the economic sector on the other side that are benefiting the most, that are agriculture and as economic unit also households. But actually, this is not the only way to mainstream ecosystem into the economy, because there can be also other policy questions, like what if something happens in one of these ecosystem type, or that provides some of these ecosystem services, such as pollination by cropland, because there are sectors that depends on these ecosystem services. So which are the economic impacts that are generated? I can tell you that economic valuation doesn't play any role when this kind of questions are asked. Because actually, when we are interested in the economic impact, what we need to do is really to track a cause-effect relationship. So what you see on the right side is the example of an invasive alien species, the Asian hornet, the Vespa velutina. On the left side, forgive me if I put in such a simplified way, I try to represent the interaction between different sector and institution within a country, and within one country and other countries that are in the modeling framework of GTAP. But actually, if intuitively we can tell, yes, there might likely be some economic impacts, what is needed to quantitatively assess this impact is this intermediate, I would say, ring of the chain that can help us to really affect what happens when, in this case, this exogenous element like an invasive alien species affects an ecosystem services and eventually the economic sector that depends on these ecosystem services. So this is actually what we try to do. Let's say that in order, we think that it's the best, probably the best way, the best things to do is to take the best available knowledge in each field. So the ecologists who create the ecological model, the economists who create the economic model, and try to bridge this to sphere, basically. And a framework that can help us in building this bridge can be this integrated accounting system that basically starts from the core SNA accounting, so the system of national accounts. And in particular here, I'm looking at the supply and use table. I mean, this is a very simplified way to show it. So we have data from some economic units that provides flow of products to other economic units. And so basically the rules of the mechanism are production, consumption, accumulation. And so what is done in this integrated system is to apply the same rule also to satellite accounts that is represented by ecosystem types. So ecosystem works like economic sector. It provides flow of services to economic units. And these economic units use this ecological input to undertake their activity. So this constitutes sorts of entry point into the economic system. And this is the ring of the chain that we try to exploit as much as we can. This is possible thanks to the system of integrated environmental and economic accounts. Maybe most of you are aware of this system. They started at the UN, they started working on this, on the SIA system since 1993. And recently we have also the ecosystem accounting extension of the SIA. And the main modules of this ecosystem accounting extension are ecosystem extend, system condition, and then we have ecosystem service, supply and use table. That is the module that really relates the ecosystem to the economic accounts. This is becoming more and more important because on the 27th of March, this ecosystem accounting extension was acknowledged as and adopted as a standard. And in Europe, Eurostat is explicitly stating that European statistics produced on the basis of the UN standard will be used for the implementation of the European Green Deal. And actually, in Europe, the European Commission started already in 2015 in moving in this direction. In fact, in 2015, there was phase 1 of this integrated system for natural capital accounting. And from 2016 to 2020, there was the phase 2 of this project. That is the one that is generating actually all the accounts and the number and the report then I'm showing you now. And the JRC was part of this consortium, but it is really worthwhile to mention that it was coordinated by Eurostat. We also have some policy partners like DG Environment and DG Research and Innovation, and also the European Environment Agency was on board. So basically, and there is also actually a website where all the maps and the data and the publication and all the updates that will keep on coming can be downloaded. Now let's move to the focus of the exercise. As we said, considering the integrated accounting system, what we are looking at is specifically the supply and use table. So basically, we have a number of ecosystem type that is providing many ecosystem services to, on the use table, the economic units. So basically these flows, this ecosystem services actual flow, represent the transaction from ecosystem type to economic units. Now in INCA we had quite a rigid structure behind this, what is assessed, mapped and quantified as actual flow. In fact, we start from the assessment of the ecosystem potential. And I would like to say this is where mostly the ecological modeling is playing a role, because here what is mapped and assessed is what ecosystems are able to provide independently whether they are used or not. But in itself, does not represent an actual flow. It's only when it interacts with the ecosystem service demand that the actual flow is generated. So the actual flow is here really represents the match between the ecosystem service potential and the ecosystem service demand. That could be economic sector, household, or for some ecosystem services, even the global society. And I would like also to add that it is not only interesting to see where and how they match, so the actual flow, but also it's interesting to see when they do not match. So they create a sort of unsatisfied demand, a demand that remains uncovered. So this is quite a useful information from a policy making perspective. Now, and so this what it is the actual flow that is the flow that is reported in the official supply and use table. In our case, for our example, what we were looking at was pollination. So basically, as ecosystem service potential, the ecological model was assessing a map the habitat suitability to host pollinators in Europe, where the ecosystem service demand is the presence of all these crops that depend on pollinator. So the ecosystem service actual flow is really the combination of where you have ecosystem able to provide naturally wild pollinators and where there is the effective demand for this wild pollinator, because only part of the crops need pollinator. It's not that all crops need pollinator. And what we found out is that also where there are crops that need pollinator, there might not be an habitat able to provide by nature the wild pollinators. Now, let's move on. Behind, just to give you, I don't have the time, and I don't think it's a purpose of this presentation to talk about the ecological models to assess the ecosystem service potential. But I think it is worthwhile to mention that in this case, a combination of an expert-based model and a species distribution model. Because we have the case of the Asian hornet impact in Europe, what we are looking at is basically the presence of these invasive alien species in the region that are mostly affected. In fact, actually, this invasive alien species was imported in a cargo from China, and it starts spreading from France, actually. And so what is going to be impacted actually is really the ecosystem contribution in terms of pollination to crop yield. So the starting point is we know which are the countries, more, not really the countries, the region within the countries that are affected by the presence of the Asian hornet. And we also know which are the pollinator-dependent crops. So from basically the accounting table, we start extracting this information that is really extracting only the pollination contribution to crops. So it's not the total crop provision, but only the pollination contribution in crop provision that is coming from this biophysical model that we are using. Then the next step is basically to identify, I would say, Inca term, what is the shock generated by the fact that we have an invasive alien species. Okay, we used, in this case, we had as a reference year 2012, because we were working on pilot's account. So what we have here is already basically the production that we have in 2012. So we asked two policy questions, basically. The first policy question is that considering that in 2012, this is the current production, what have we missed in terms of gains if the Asian hornet were not there? And the second policy question is, considering that in some countries, I mean, France is almost covered by this problem. But in other countries, the Asian hornet is only spreading around. So if nothing is done in this country where you have the wasp spreading around, what is going to be the hypothetical loss? So we asked this to a policy question. And I mean, for the sake of simplicity, I'm now reporting only the shock that were calculated based on the hypothetical loss, basically. So these are, in percentage terms, the loss that would occur for crop type in all these countries that are where the presence of this invasive alien species has been recorded. But as you can imagine, if we want to move from INCA to GTAP, we need to kind of harmonize classification and data. In terms of grouping the country, we adopted the EU GEO scheme. So we kept outside any group the individual country that were directly affected by the wasp. And this is, I think, the table that requires a little bit of work. Try to identify the correspondence between the GTAP codes and aggregation and the crop classification that we had for pollination in our ecosystem service accounts. Now, the problem is that, as you for sure you notice, not all products reported in vegetable, fruits and nuts are affected by the Asian hornet. So basically there is the need to shock not the whole sector, but only part of it. So in order to understand how much of the whole sector we need to shock, we went back to Eurostat data set and tried to calculate the percentage of these crops compared to the whole group of vegetable, fruits and pulses. And from then we had a general estimate, basically, that we applied. But I mean, we are aware that this kind of disaggregation are very rough, but we kind of needed an example to break the ice, let's say. So the next step is, okay, we had a shock in INCA terms, and then we move to a shock in GTAP terms. So as an example here, I'm still reporting the hypothetical loss example. And so basically what we did was to take really the GTAP model and software as it is, and we were inserting shock by countries and by group of crops, and then had the model run, basically. So what were the results that we obtained? But before showing you the results, I really need to make clear that the purpose in this case is not really to look at the specific number, because we are aware this is just an initial attempt. We are aware that probably a better application to GTAP needs to be undertaken. But what we wanted to see is that can this bridging work? And actually we see impact of the Asian hornet in terms of misgain. We choose 4 variables, for outcomes from the long list of outcomes that GTAP is able to provide. And first of all, the change in the production quantity, the change in export quantity that, as expected, are positive. I mean, if the wasp were not there, we would have had higher production in all the country where the presence of the wasp was actually recorded. And as a consequence, also the import price would have a negative side. So there was a sign. There was actually confirming what we were expecting. And in terms of hypothetical loss, if nothing is going to be done in the countries that are only initially affected by the presence of Asian hornet? Are there going to be consequences? So you allowed basically the Asian hornet to spread as much as it can. Then you see that, of course, you have change in production quantity that is negative, a change in export quantity that is negative, and import price that, of course, is increasing. So that let's say that the expected changes also on the economic side are there. Now, how reliable this first run of changes is something that needs to be further explored, because, as I said, we insert the shock in the model, in the GTAP model, as it was, without having any modification. Now, what is needed? I think that this, at the end of the day, the question we had in mind, the first question, the main point that we had in mind, can we bridge ecosystem service accounts with GTAP? I mean, it has a positive answer. Yes, it can, because we are talking the same language. That is basically the integrated accounting system. So something, a satellite information that consistently link to economic accounts that are the basis for most economic models and tools. But in order to have it running, what is really needed is a replicable and systematic ecosystem service supply and use table. And from this point of view, I can tell that now we are in INCA phase 3, so the follow-up of INCA. And what is being doing during this INCA phase 3 is the knowledge transfer to a contractor that is creating basically GIS plugin tools that allows to replicate all the models that we have been using in INCA. And so it is possible. Anyone can use these models to replicate this GIS tool to replicate the models. And actually, in Europe, there is also a legislative proposal to encourage member states to have ecosystem service accounts as the accounts to be filled up. So the model will be there, so it will be possible to replicate it, all the models for the ecosystem services. On the GTAP side, I think, a robust procedure to reclassify and disaggregate, because this is where we had to do some investigation. But to be honest, I would really appreciate if a robust way to proceed in this direction were there. Because I'm sure that a better estimates can be undertaken to disaggregate even within the sectors. I mean, we just started with the one ecosystem services, but I'm sure that the same problem might apply for other ecosystem services. A guideline to analyze GTAP outcomes. As I said, we only choose 4 among the long list of outcomes that are there. But I mean, it would be great to understand, to explore better the power of the policy message that we can take out from GTAP. And also, we can think about set a range of scenarios based on acknowledged policy need. Now I have moving to the last slide. I promise probably I'm running late. I apologize for that.
Yes.
Okay. So what can be done next? So this is one of the figures taken from this Eurostat report, where you can see the flow between the ecosystem types and the services already. The 7 ecosystem services we are presented is very clear. Actually, what can be done next is really to understand how each of these services relates to the economic sector, because in the case of pollination, this was quite direct, but there can be some other services where you need some intermediate processing before finding the direct linkage to the economic sector. So it would be really great to work on that. And actually, we are willing to keep on working on that and having other application for on this linking, on this bridging between INCA and GTAP. Thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize for running late.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. We already have a long list of questions by Iman in the chat, but I would abuse of my position as a chairman to make a general comment on your work. I know you have been working on this for long, and you started by working on the data and on the integration of environmental accounts in national accounts. Now, I'm a little bit critical about this. This is the way I see it. No, CG model are parameters. The CG models are calibrated on social accounting matrices. So you can imagine that if instead of using a conventional SAM, you have a larger SAM, which has more rows, more columns, that includes environmental factors, environmental indicators, you can imagine to recalibrate a model with all this new informational data. Now, unfortunately, this is not the case. Why it is not the case? Because as far as I know, environmental data, they are not expressed in value terms. Normally, they are in physical units of measure. So this means that they, as it stands now, they cannot enter into the general equilibrium model. You need to create an association between some endogenous and exogenous variable in the model and some environmental variables. For example, in the output, if you create an association between output level and emissions of greenhouse gases, then you can convert the result of a simulation in terms of the associated impacts in terms of emissions or water demand or whatever. What you are doing is a little different things. You are actually changing something, in this case, on the environment, and you transfer this information into the general equilibrium model. But then you need to create an association between, for example, sectoral productivity and degree of invasion of alien species. So this, in other words, you don't have in the productions function in the general equilibrium model, you don't have an extra factor called pollination. You don't have that thing at the moment. And it will be difficult to have a model which these features are at present. So you need to basically say, if there is a change in pollination services, then I need to translate this impact into something that is already in the model, for example, total factor productivity. So this is the problem at the moment I see, that despite all this effort of integrating the two accounts, when it comes to modeling, you still need to bridge the two worlds. Okay, this is just a comment. I don't know if you would agree, or we just go directly to the question raised by Iman.
Yeah, well, actually, I think I mostly agree with what you say, because but probably it's important also to consider how the ecosystem services, what is the role the ecosystem services play, because in some cases it's about really providing ecological input to something that is already in SNA. And this is the case of pollination, of crop provision, of timber provision, and so on. So in this case, you are acting on something that is already there, and so you see what happens. In other cases, I'm agree with you, there is not such a direct relationship, because there are some ecosystem services that play a role of protection. There are some ecosystem services that acts like, as you said, a sink for negative externality. So in that case, I agree with you, you need to create a sort of intermediate step. But it really depends which group of ecosystem services you are addressing. At least this is the...
Okay, Alessandra, this will be a long discussion, but I need to consider the question that Iman put on the chat. First one is, Alessandra, what is the spatial and temporal resolution of the ecosystem modeling? How about your economic model?
The temporal, actually, we have these pilot accounts on the 2000, 2006, and 2012, because when we started with the INCA project, these were the core inland cover that we had at our that we could use basically. So these are the pilot years where we worked on for in temporal terms. And spatial terms, we are working on a grid that is 10 kilometer per 10 kilometer. So we are, this is the minimum level of disaggregation that we can reach.
What was the units in the table of pollination dependency by country?
Tons, because actually what we applied was a ratio. Through the ecological model, we were able to establish what is the ratio that can be applied in terms of total input needed for crop provision. So we know that a part of this input is provided by pollinators. So this is what we applied, and this is how we represent it in physical terms.
In calculating the share of pollinator-dependent fruits, did you use quantity or volume from Eurostat? I think in case of positive answer, I think, how is it converted to dollar values?
Well, actually, we used this. Yeah, we took the total amount of crop that was from Eurostat that was consistent with the GTAP, let's say, definition, and then we extracted only the crops that were covered by the pollination model. So this is how we changed the total the application, the shock that we applied. So it's not the shock calculated over the whole group, like it included it all, but only on the part of the group that we estimated based on the Eurostat volume data.
Why the impact on change in production in the rest of the world is so high in slide 17?
This is one question we asked many times. Actually, we also asked colleagues, but we did not have an answer for that, because what is fun is that when we applied. When we were not, when we considering fruits and vegetables all together, fruit, vegetable, and plants all together, we did not get these results on the rest of the world. When we only considered the crops covered and not like it affect all the group, then we got that result. But to be honest, this is one of the questions that we need further elaboration, I think. Yeah, I would like to know as well.
All right. Are there other questions?
May I clarify one of my comments?
Please.
So when you're splitting the vegetable and fruit from the Eurostat data, if you are using volume, I think it is important to consider different prices, because if you don't, vegetable and fruit includes a wide variety of commodities, and the prices also is in a wide range. So some of these pollinator dependent crops are very high value, and the rest probably are not. So I think so. I would recommend you look at what we do in simple G model. So in simple G, we calculate the corn equivalent and we consider relative prices of different crops. So that way, it will be more consistent with GTAP because they are in dollar values. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Now go for the third and last presentation by Ron Sanz, talking about tracking calories in CG models from fork to farm. Ron, you can start by sharing your screen.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, one here. Okay, that look okay to everybody? So I think we're still maybe in this 2-minute transition, but I'll start talking anyways. I'm Ron Sands. I'm from the Economic Research Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And about a year and a half ago, most of the Economic Research Service moved from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City, Missouri. So I actually split my time between Kansas City and Washington, D.C. So the title is Tracking Calories in CGE Models from Fork to Farm. Usually you hear this as from farm to fork, but I reversed those two terms to emphasize the fact that this is a demand-driven analysis, that it's consumer diets that are actually driving what's going on in the rest of the economy, especially in terms of land use and agricultural production. So part of the motivation for this talk is that a major challenge for economic modelers is matching monetary flows in the benchmark social accounting matrix. And here we're using GTAP 9 as a social accounting matrix, which has a 2011 base year. What I do is I take the GTAP data and then use the tools developed by Tom Rutherford, the GTAP and GAMS tools, to convert the model into the GAMS modeling system, and then set it up as a dynamic recursive model that runs in 5-year time steps from 2011 through 2101. But actually, for this exercise, I'm only reporting results out to 2050. Part of the reason is that inputs become quite speculative as you move beyond 2050. Also, price effects can become very large as you move out to 2101, which take a little bit more talking through and understanding exactly what's going on there. I use the longer time frame actually for greenhouse gas mitigation studies. So a big challenge is to match quantity flows, especially for energy, agricultural commodities, and land. So for energy, it's joules. For agricultural commodities, you really have a choice. You could use tons. I've chosen to use calories because it's easier to aggregate and compare food products and crops grown on the land. So you'll see calories used here throughout as the quantity unit for agriculture. And I won't say a lot about the land allocation and the modeling, but that's another presentation and story all by itself, trying to match up land quantities and land values. So this paper describes, or this presentation describes, the methodology that I've developed for my CGE model. It's called the Future Agricultural Resources Model. And I'm using 3 diet scenarios as a demonstration of this methodology in the second half of my presentation. And in terms of calories, I focus on 2 measures. One is total food calories, and actually that's food calories available for consumption from the FAO food balance tables. But also the model tracks and uses the demand-driven structure of the model to calculate crop calories derived and grown on the land. So the outline here of my presentation, we'll talk about the economic framework and then the methodology that I use to actually match up food quantities and food monetary values, and then an application to global diet scenarios. So the 3 scenarios for diets that I'll present here are: first, a static diet, which means that consumers in each of the world regions have the same mix of food calories and same quantity of food calories that they do in the reference year of the model. And that's based on FAO food balance tables. The second one is an income-driven diet, which is based on a relationship between food consumed and food income, or consumer income and food prices. The third diet scenario is a 50% convergence toward the Eat Lancet Healthy Reference diet. Now, by coincidence, I was watching Alessandro Gatto's presentation yesterday in session number 30, and he also was using a Eat Lancet Healthy diet and a 50% conversion to that instead of full conversion to that. So we did not coordinate at all, but I think we both arrived independently as that being a reasonable diet scenario to consider in our analyses. So I did mention a lot of this already. The economic framework is the future agricultural resources model. It's a dynamic recursive model, and land use can shift among crops, pasture, and managed forests in response to some drivers. Now, the model is set up to simulate quite a few drivers simultaneously if necessary. I usually don't try to simulate them all simultaneously, but the 6 key drivers are population, and those projections come from the United Nations. The projections of income, those are taken from the shared socioeconomic pathways. Projections of agricultural productivity, those are highly stylized, and that's maybe the weakest part of simulation modeling of this type. The fourth driver is dietary preference. That's the one I'm focusing on here. Fifth one I'm not focusing on is climate change impacts on agriculture. Sixth one is greenhouse gas mitigation and the role of bioenergy especially. That's where you really need a long time frame up to the end of the century is in the mitigation scenarios, especially if you're looking at scenarios that want to get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions. And if you're using bioenergy, that might have a big impact on the rest of the model. So the key data sets are obviously the GTAP SAM, food balance sheets from FAO, and also this is actually part of the food balance sheets, a table for converting food consumption by tons to calories, which you can actually derive from data in the food balance sheets. So these are the world regions that I've set up in the farm model. These 13 world regions are the same that are used by the AgMIP model comparison study. AgMIP stands for Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project. So I use this regional disaggregation a lot, just pretty much for everything I do. This is the way that production sectors are aggregated from the GTAP data set to the farm model. It retains all of the GTAP sectors for primary agriculture and food processing. Also retains all of the energy production, transformation, and energy-intensive industries, and mostly aggregates the services sectors. So the consumer demand system is actually important here, and this is actually done in conjunction with Sherman Robinson, who helped out a lot with us talking through actually how should we do this. So the one thing you want to avoid in your consumer demand system is having calories increase at the same rate as income, because in these income scenarios, per capita GDP is increasing very rapidly in some of the developing countries. So you need a demand system that still gives you reasonable calories per capita consumed for each of the food products as incomes increase. So we have a two-stage demand system. The first stage is a linear expenditure system. And so what that stage does is it maps the primary agriculture and food processing commodities from GTAP to some first stage consumption categories. So the grains are grouped together in a grain products category. Some of these are kept separate, the oil seeds, the sugar, fruits and vegetables. Then we have a large other crops category, and then also a large animal products category. So animal products are just one category in the first stage, but then in the second stage, it's actually a constant elasticity substitution within that category. And so even though total animal products may be constrained by the linear expenditure system, in second category or second stage, you can actually substitute among these animal products. I've also put forestry in here, primarily because that is also a driver of land use. And for forestry as well, you don't want forest products and paper products increasing at the same rate as income, because that affects land use. And so that is also pulled into this linear expenditure system framework. So here's just a reminder of sort of what a food balance sheet looks like. These are just a few rows from the U.S. Food balance sheet for 2013. But basically, you just have this identity that all of these items, production plus imports plus stock change minus exports minus calories used for feed minus seed minus other ends up what gets consumed for food. So this is in tons, but I actually convert this to calories for the model itself. And here's a diagram, which is actually not very easy to explain, but the basic idea is to take the food balance sheet that comes from FAO, convert that to calories, and then for the rows that you see in blue, I actually remove the monetary values from the input-output table or the social accounting matrix and replace it with quantities in terms of calories. And so there are 14 rows where that happens. The other rows stay in terms of monetary units. But all of the calorie accounting is done within these rows that are colored in blue. And so I substitute in quantities here, and then I rebalance the social accounting matrix so that essentially we have the law of one price imposed for these products that are in blue, that net of tax margins and transportation margins, that everything should have the same price within a particular world region. So we do end up with a social accounting matrix in monetary values, but you can always map back to quantities in these blue rows, and you can calculate calorie implications in physical units for those. Okay, so let's go to an application here. And again, there are 3 diet scenarios. The static diet, everybody retains the diet they had in the model base year. There's an income-driven diet based on historical food consumption patterns and responds to increasing per capita income. And then there's this 50% conversion to the Eat Lancet healthy diet. And I'll explain those in a moment here, but basically, average consumption of food calories converges to 2,500 calories per person per day in a full conversion, but I'm only converting halfway to that. So here's historical diet patterns, which give you some sense of even in recent history of the past 20 or 30 years, you see a general trend as incomes increase of more calories consumed in total, but also a shift within the calories consumed towards more animal products. And that's particularly strong in China. Very large increase in animal products consumed for China in terms of calories between 1990 and 2013. Increase is not as great in the US or India, but in India, it's a very small share of the total calories regardless. Okay, so here's some of the data that I use that show you a little bit of the change in consumption of animal products and how that differs over time. So this is actually from projections to 2050 of animal product consumption by different regions. So you see kind of a clustering here according to the regional definition I have here. I've clustered the regions into three. Developing regions, which are basically India, other South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And then the richer countries, the OECD regions, and then all the other regions are labeled as transition regions. So you see a clustering where the rich countries are pretty much saturated in terms of animal product consumption per capita, and there's little response to increase in income for those. For the transition regions, they're starting to approach animal product consumption of the rich regions, but in the developing regions, we don't have the full transition to such a large consumption of animal products, but still increasing. Just a little bit as to how these diets ended up being stimulated. There's a fair amount going on in this chart here. So on the left, there's historical calories per person per day. This is animal products, just animal products here, where it's split up into the three types of regions, developing, transition, and OECD. So a very large variation across those from 200 to 800 calories per day. One thing I should note here is there is a distinction in the model between calories actually consumed and calories available for consumption. That's why you see here in this graph that the animal products consumed in the rich countries is only approaching 800 calories per day, whereas in historical data, it's actually closer to 1,000 when you talk about food available for consumption, which includes post-retail food waste. So this here is modeling the food actually consumed by the demand system in the model. So the left is historical, and on the right there are three sets of columns. The middle set is actually the static, and that's where we turn off the price and income response for the static. So you'll see that looks almost exactly like the historical consumption. We hold that fixed over time. For the income-driven scenario in the right hand columns, you see that calories consumed for animal products is increasing for developing countries. It's increasing for the transition countries, but we assume saturation essentially for the OECD countries. Now, then there's this 50% healthy reference diet scenario. And that's a case where the developing countries are actually consuming more. The transition countries are consuming a little bit less in terms of calories per person per day of animal products. And the wealthy countries are consuming quite a bit less in terms of calories per day of animal products. Still don't reach convergence among the three types of countries. If we did full convergence to the healthy reference diet, you would see those three columns in that healthy diet set actually coming together to be equal to each other. Okay, so just a little bit more about this conversion from food calories to crop calories, and again about the units. There is no unique measure of agricultural production. It could be, metric tons, could be calories, or it could be an economic quantity index with prices as weights. Tons are useful for aggregating a limited number of similar goods, such as grains. But if you want to really aggregate a wider set of agricultural products, then calories make sense. So that's what I've used in this analysis. Turns out that crop calories are always greater than food calories because of the losses of converting feed to animal products. And for the crop calories, this really represents primary production in terms of calories produced from the land before processing into animal or food products. Okay, so I'm going to show you this is my final or my result slide. And this is a plot of food calories, and this is at the world level. Food calories consumed at the world level through 2050 under the three diet scenarios, and the corresponding crop calories that need to be produced to support those diets represented by the food calories up through 2050. So the dark line, the dark blue line and the dark green line are the static diets. And the food calories actually pick up from or calibrated to the historical food calories from FAO food balances through 2013. So I've got a pretty good match there in terms of picking up from that point. Now with the Eat Lancet, 50% Eat Lancet healthy diet, because consumption is increasing in developing countries but decreasing in richer countries, the quantities of food calories consumed under the Eat Lancet healthy diet are about the same. Actually, they're slightly higher in this scenario than the static diet. But because of the composition of animal products versus food products, when you go up to crop calories, the number of crop calories needed to support the healthy reference diet is actually lower than the static diet. For the income-driven diet, obviously we're turning on the income and price response, and the income response is really driving this because incomes are increasing. So you see an increase in food consumption per capita, which translates in total calories of food increasing as well over time. And then there's a magnifying effect because a lot of these extra calories are animal products. You need more than one crop calorie for an increase in food calorie for the animal product component. So crop calories actually become quite large in the income-driven diet.
Ronald, the time is over. Okay, thank you.
All right, yeah. This is my last slide, just to summarize. Okay, so I presented the methodology for modeling these dietary scenarios. One takeaway is that the range of demand for world crop calories is wider than the range of demand for food calories, with sort of the exception that with the Eat Lancet healthy reference diet, this highlights the distinction between food calories and crop calories. They can actually move in opposite directions. In the scenario I showed, world food calories increase slightly in that scenario, but crop calories decline relative to the diet scenario. So that is an interesting, very interesting diet scenario design. So thank you. I will stop there, and I'm actually going to stop sharing so I can see what's happening in the chat here.
Thank you, Ron. Indeed, we have already a couple of questions from the chat. The first one is one for me, actually. It's a kind of semi-technical question. In the standard calibration process, you said that you replace values for calories. No, but all prices are set normally to 1 when you calibrate the general group model. When you introduce calories, are you getting price per calorie as a byproduct, so to say, of the calibration process?
Yes, yes, that's true. So I do get, dollars per, dollars per some multiple of calories. Yeah, so we do get an actual price that's different from 1 in this case. The same thing happens on the energy side, that we do get dollars per gigajoule as the
yes.
As the price. And so this essentially what I'm doing is translating the methodology that we've used for energy to agriculture to bring these quantities and prices in terms of quantities into the analysis. As I mentioned earlier in the first presentation in this session, once the model is set up, I spend a lot more time on the data setup side than on the model itself, and that's where all the work comes in to get these physical units into the modeling framework to be able to talk about, I guess it's dollars per Dollars per gigacalorie, I think is the units, but it's taking a methodology that's been very useful on the energy side, and on the energy side, the modeling program I work with most is the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum, which is a mix of partial equilibrium and general equilibrium models. And the partial equilibrium models are all mostly in quantities. They have market clearing, so they can bring in some of the economics. But on the CGE side, it's a lot more difficult, I think, to do this data setup and data calibration to the monetary flows. But yes, we do get actual dollars per unit of agricultural product.
There was also a question from Iman. What is your assumption regarding productivity growth of animal products versus crops?
Very good question. I'm actually assuming a higher rate of agricultural productivity growth for the crops than for the animal products. In some regions, there has been a very rapid growth recently in terms of productivity for animal products, especially in China. But it's hard to say, how is that going to play out in the future? Is this sort of, going from one type of production system to another, and then you're limited in terms of productivity growth? I don't know. And so, and also in crops, we have a long history of agricultural productivity growth that's been fairly steady over time. And so these are ad hoc assumptions I've made. And I have a reference scenario that I've used here for agricultural productivity. And I just don't have a good way to say what will agricultural productivity growth be in the future. I think, maybe the best we have is looking at what has happened over the past 30 years or so and projecting that out into the future. I would say this is the weakest part of this type of CGE modeling, is what we use for agricultural productivity growth in the future. I tend to think that since we've seen fairly stable or declining agricultural prices over time, over the past 30 years, that it may be a reasonable assumption to assume fairly stable agricultural prices in the future for your reference scenario, but then also running some sensitivity analyses with lower and higher rates of productivity growth. Then there's also the issue of how does that assumption about productivity growth translate into your production functions, your CES production functions in the model? Is it just, for crops, is it just land augmenting, or is it factor neutral augmenting, or some combination? For crop productivity, and in fact for most of the production sectors in the model, I pretty much use essentially all factor augmenting except for capital. I guess just because of the notion that if I have in all sectors of the model, if I have capital productivity increasing over time, then the capital output ratio of the economy should be declining, which we don't observe. So essentially, I don't apply this productivity rate to capital, but I apply it to all other inputs. Again, this is a tough part of the model. I feel much more confident about all other parts of the model than speculating about productivity in the future. But that's, I think, where we need expert opinion on that from groups like, say, the International Food Policy Research Institute and other biophysical modelers that have a sense of, what are the biophysical constraints that you need to think about in projecting productivity into the future.
Okay, we got another question from the chat from Vladimir Korovin. Can you talk a bit more about the calibration of the demand system and its relation to income elasticities? are they calibrated to FAO projections? What is the magnitude for animal products income elasticity in China?
Okay, yeah, very good question. We spent a lot of time thinking about this. Yes, they are calibrated to FAO projections of consumption by these food categories out to 2050. So essentially, I have FAO projections for quantities, and those actually appeared in one of the graphs I showed earlier, which I didn't really mention at the time. But yeah, that's a very important piece of this. And then from the income growth scenarios from the shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs, these are income scenarios constructed by the International Global Change Research Community. Then that provides income per capita. So that's basically what we have. We have some calibration data points for the model base year and for 2050 on income and quantity. And from those, we derive income elasticities. Now, there's one sort of wrinkle to this. We also allow income elasticities to decline over time. And that's something of an ad hoc assumption. I guess for China, that's one that we model as declining over time. I don't have that number right in front of me. I'm working on a report where I have those numbers, but it's somewhere in the range of 0.3 for the income elasticity, but declining over time for animal products. Yeah, so it's certainly not one-to-one increase in animal products as income goes up, but as China has become wealthier, that income elasticity falls. So the general pattern is higher income elasticities in developing countries, lower in wealthier countries, and that these elasticities decline over time. So, so the calibrated parameters for the linear expenditure system, those actually change over time to match this declining rate of income elasticity. So I actually have to go through an iterative process in the model to get that to calibrate. And so I'm iterating on these linear expenditure system parameters until I get my income elasticities to hit their targets.
Okay, are there other questions? Yes, I see some raised hands. I don't know who was the first one. Well, maybe Tobias, have something question to ask.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering about the metrics where you mapped the calories. You mainly mapped them directly to some sectors and to private demand, but what about the calories that go from the food production to the other food sector, or for example, the trade sector where you have restaurants and other food consumption? Or do you assume there's the same calorie consumption as it is in the private demand?
Let's see. So private demand would include the calories eaten either at home or away from home in restaurants. And in the standard GTAP SAM, it's really hard to trace those through the economy. A lot of these food products go into large food processing sectors, then go off into service sectors. And so that's essentially why I've replaced a lot of the structure of the original SAM with the structure that's in the food balance tables. I'm sure there are things I've missed, and there may be some values from the services sector, especially restaurants, that I may have missed in the accounting. But I think at least I've captured the quantity flows represented by the food balance tables. I probably missed some of the monetary flows. I spent a lot of time on this, and I know, Tobias, you mentioned how much time you spent on setting up the data. for your fish sectors, and I'm sure there are areas for improvement. But basically, I just could not track calories in the original SAM input-output structure. I just had to replace a lot of it.
Great. Maybe, Iman, you have another question?
No, I just want to have a comment here. So probably some of you are aware of regarding productivity. Tom Hertel, Keith Feedley, and Juris Paulus recently have been working on estimating productivity on agriculture. I encourage people to look at that and follow this. I think that's the state of the art. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Keith is also works at the Economic Research Service, and so I I pay careful attention to what he's done. His historical analysis is really excellent. Great, thanks everybody.
Well, thank you all. I think we can close our session. I think it has been a wonderful session. We all were very interesting presentation and also discussions. Thank you all to all the presenters and participants. We close here, and we possibly see virtually, of course, in the closing session. Thank you all. See you soon. Bye bye.